When I opened the door and saw Ethan standing there, I almost didn't recognize him. It had been 2 years since I'd last seen him, and the boy who used to slouch in my kitchen, raiding the fridge while laughing with my daughter, was gone. In his place stood a man, broad-shouldered, confident, and utterly composed. He smiled when our eyes met, the same easy grin he'd always had, but there was something different in his expression now. Something I couldn't quite place. "Hi, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered. "Ethan," I replied, trying to mask my surprise. "It's been a while." He held up a cardboard box. "I found some of Lila's things in my closet when I was cleaning out my apartment. Thought I'd drop them off." I stepped aside to let him in, the scent of his cologne catching me off guard as he brushed past me. It was subtle, woodsy, and entirely too adult for the Ethan I remembered. "Lila's out right now," I said, closing the door behind him. "But I can take it for her," he nodded, setting the box on the kitchen counter. "No problem. How've you been?" The question felt casual, but the way he leaned against the counter, his eyes lingering on me for a beat too long, made it feel different. "I've been fine," I said quickly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "Busy with work, as always." Ethan smiled, his gaze warm and steady. "You look good," he said, his tone light but sincere. I froze for half a second, caught off guard by the compliment. It wasn't the words themselves. Plenty of people told me I looked good for my age, but something about the way he said it made my pulse quicken. "Thank you," I managed, my voice a little too soft. He stayed longer than I expected, chatting easily about his job as a photographer and how life had been since he and Lila broke up. I found myself relaxing, slipping into the rhythm of the conversation as if no time had passed. But every now and then, I caught his eyes flicking to mine, a glint of something unreadable in his expression. When he finally left, I stood in the doorway, watching him walk to his car. My heart was pounding for reasons I couldn't or wouldn't admit to myself. Later that night, as I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he looked at me, the way his voice lingered in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But when he showed up again the next night, saying he'd forgotten something, I knew deep down that nothing about this was going to be simple. If you had told me 2 years ago that Ethan would reappear in my life like this, I would have laughed. Back then, he was just my daughter's college boyfriend, a sweet, somewhat quiet young man who always seemed a little out of his depth when he visited our house. Lila and Ethan started dating during her sophomore year. He was studying photography, and she was majoring in communications. Their relationship seemed casual, more a product of proximity and shared friend groups than a deep, lasting connection. Still, Ethan had been polite, respectful, and always quick to offer a hand when I needed help around the house. I never thought much of him beyond that. To me, he was just another one of Lila's boyfriends. Handsome and charming in a way that young men often are, but ultimately not someone I expected to have any real staying power in her life. Or mine. At the time, my life was in a transitional phase. My divorce had been finalized a year earlier, after 2 decades of marriage, and I was still trying to figure out who I was without the role of wife defining me. The end of my marriage wasn't a dramatic affair. There was no screaming, no cheating, just the slow, painful realization that we'd grown apart. My ex-husband and I had built a life together, raised a daughter, and weathered all the usual storms of marriage. But somewhere along the way, the love that had once bound us turned into something distant, cold. When he moved out, I told myself I'd be fine. I was 46, financially stable, with a career I loved as an interior designer. But beneath the surface, I felt untethered. The house was too quiet, the evenings too long, and the loneliness too heavy to ignore. That's when I started pouring myself into work. Designing spaces for other people was easier than confronting the emptiness in my own. I took on more clients, spent late nights perfecting layouts, and convinced myself that staying busy was the same as moving forward. But the truth was, I felt invisible. At 48, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. Besides Lila's mom, besides the woman who picked up the pieces after a failed marriage. Ethan had been a constant presence in our home during the 2 years he and Lila dated. He came over for dinners, joined us on family outings, and even helped me set up the Christmas tree one year when Lila wasn't in the mood. He was the kind of boyfriend any mother would approve of, attentive, thoughtful, and endlessly patient with Lila's moods. But their relationship ended as quietly as it began. They broke up during Lila's senior year, citing busy schedules and a mutual realization that they wanted different things. I didn't ask for details, and Lila didn't offer them. She moved on quickly, diving into her final projects and later her new job in marketing. I hadn't thought about Ethan much since then. He had faded into the background of my memories, one of many people who had passed through our lives without leaving a lasting mark. So when he showed up at my door that day, I was unprepared for the flood of emotions that followed. The first time I saw him again, I was struck by how much he had changed. The shy, slightly awkward boy I remembered was gone, replaced by someone who carried himself with quiet confidence. His voice was deeper, his shoulders broader, and there was a maturity in his eyes that made it hard to look away. Our conversation that afternoon was light, almost superficial. He asked about Lila, and I filled him in on her new job, her recent move back home, and how well she was adjusting to post-college life. He shared stories about his photography projects, his excitement about an upcoming exhibit, and how much he loved the freedom of being his own boss. But beneath the casual exchanges, there was something else, an undercurrent of familiarity that felt both comforting and unsettling. He lingered a little too long after dropping off the box, leaning against the counter as if he wasn't ready to leave. And when he finally did, the way he looked at me before walking out the door made my chest tighten. That night, I tried to push the encounter out of my mind, telling myself it was nothing. But when Ethan returned the following evening, claiming he'd forgotten something in the box he dropped off, I knew deep down that wasn't true. Lila wasn't home when Ethan came by again. She was out with friends, leaving the house quiet and still. I answered the door, surprised to see him standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets and a sheepish grin on his face. "Sorry to bother you again," he said. "I think I left a memory card in the box. Mind if I take another look?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let him in. As he sifted through the box on the counter, I found myself watching him, noticing things I hadn't before, the way his jaw tightened when he concentrated, the way his hair curled slightly at the edges, the way his presence filled the room in a way that felt different. When he looked up and caught me staring, I felt my face flush. "Did you find it?" I asked quickly, desperate to break the silence. "Not yet," he said, his tone casual. But the way his eyes lingered on mine told a different story. He found the memory card a few moments later, holding it up triumphantly. "Got it," he said, slipping it into his pocket. I walked him to the door, my pulse racing for reasons I couldn't quite explain. "Thanks for letting me dig through her stuff again," he said, his hand resting on the doorframe as he turned to face me. "Of course," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine as if he wanted to say something more. And then, before I could process what was happening, he reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "You know," he said, his voice low and steady, "you're even more beautiful now than I remember." I froze, caught between the instinct to pull away and the inexplicable desire to lean closer. "Ethan," I started, but he shook his head, stepping back with a small, almost regretful smile. "Good night, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice lingering in the air long after he was gone. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of misplaced attraction. But deep down I knew better. Ethan had awakened something in me that I hadn't felt in years, something I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. I didn't know where this was heading, or if it would go anywhere at all. But as I sat in the quiet of my living room, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air, I couldn't deny that something between us had changed. And I wasn't sure I wanted it to change back. I didn't expect to see Ethan again so soon after that night, but life has a funny way of weaving people together when you least expect it. Or maybe it wasn't life. Maybe it was him. It was 2 days later when he showed up at my house again. Lila was out with her friends, and I was in the middle of rearranging the bookshelves in the living room when the knock on the door startled me. I opened it to find him standing there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. He said, smiling in that easy, confident way of his. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. Hope I'm not interrupting. I hesitated, glancing at the half-empty shelves behind me. No, it's fine. Come in. As he stepped inside, I couldn't help but notice how effortlessly he filled the space, how natural it felt to have him there, even though I knew it shouldn't. We started talking, just like we had the last time he'd come over. At first, it was casual. He told me about a new photography project he was working on, a series of portraits capturing people in their natural environments. I listened, genuinely interested, but also hyper-aware of how close he was sitting to me on the couch. At some point, the conversation shifted. You seem different, he said, leaning back and studying me with those sharp, perceptive eyes. Different how? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. I don't know. Happier maybe, or more confident. I laughed, shaking my head. That's funny, considering I feel like I've been barely holding it together lately. He tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. You don't give yourself enough credit. There was a weight to his words that made my chest tighten. I opened my mouth to deflect, to brush it off as nothing, but he wasn't done. I mean it, he said softly. You're incredible, Mrs. Carter, you always have been. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the quickening of my pulse. Ethan, I started, my voice catching on his name. I know, he said, cutting me off. I know I shouldn't say these things, but I've been thinking about you since the moment I saw you again. I can't help it. I stared at him, torn between the part of me that knew this was wrong and the part that didn't want him to stop. You used to come here for Lila, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I know, he said again, his voice steady. But I'm not here for her now. Before I could respond, he leaned forward, closing the small gap between us. His hand reached out, brushing against mine, and I felt a spark that sent shivers down my spine. You can tell me to leave, he said, his voice low and rough. I will if that's what you want. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Instead, I found myself leaning toward him, my breath hitching as his fingers traced a line up my arm. It was such a simple touch, but it set something inside me on fire. Ethan, this is wrong, I managed, even as I felt myself inching closer. Maybe, he said, his lips so close now that I could feel the warmth of his breath. But it doesn't feel wrong. And then he kissed me. It was gentle at first, as if he was testing the waters, waiting for me to pull away. But when I didn't, it deepened, his hands sliding to my waist as he pulled me closer. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, guilt, desire, fear. But my body betrayed me, responding to his touch in ways I couldn't control. Before I knew it, we were tangled together on the couch, his lips trailing down my neck as his hands explored me with a reverence that made my heart ache. Ethan, wait, I said, my voice shaky. He froze instantly, pulling back just enough to look at me. Are you okay? I nodded, swallowing hard. This is just... I don't know if we should. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks. Tell me to stop, he said again, his eyes searching mine. I couldn't. Instead, I pulled him back to me, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt as our lips met again. This time, there was no hesitation. We didn't make it far. Just to the floor, where the soft rug cushioned us as we gave in to the pull that had been building between us since the moment he walked through the door. When it was over, we lay side by side, the quiet hum of the room filling the space between us. I stared at the ceiling, my chest rising and falling as I tried to process what had just happened. Ethan turned to face me, propping himself up on one elbow. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. I don't know what this means, I admitted. Neither do I, he said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. But I don't regret it. His words hit me like a jolt, and for a moment I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, something that scared me as much as it excited me. I didn't say anything, and he didn't push. Instead, he pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead before getting up to leave. I'll see you soon, he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that made my stomach flutter. As the door clicked shut behind him, I stayed where I was, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. I knew this was the beginning of something dangerous, something that could unravel everything I'd worked so hard to hold together. But as much as I wanted to stop it, I couldn't deny the truth. I didn't want it to end. Ethan didn't wait long before coming back. It was 2 nights later when I heard the now familiar knock at my door. Lila was out again, this time staying over at a friend's place, and I'd just finished cleaning up after dinner when the sound made my pulse quicken. I didn't hesitate this time. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket and that same confident smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, I felt the heat rising in my chest. "Hey," he said, his voice soft but charged with unspoken meaning. "Ethan," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. There were no excuses this time. No forgotten items, no pretense of casual conversation. The second the door closed behind him, he was on me, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that left no room for doubt about why he was here. After that night, it was like a floodgate had opened. Ethan and I fell into a rhythm of stolen moments and whispered promises, each encounter more reckless than the last. We didn't talk about what it meant or where it was going, we just let it happen, swept up in the intensity of it all. He'd text me late at night, simple messages that sent my heart racing. "Can I see you?" Sometimes I'd resist, telling him it was too risky, that we needed to be more careful. But more often than not, I found myself giving in, unable to deny the pull he had on me. One evening, he showed up unexpectedly, just as the sun was setting. Lila had left for a weekend trip with friends, and the house was quiet and still. "I couldn't wait," he said when I opened the door, his voice low and filled with urgency. I barely had time to respond before his hands were on me, pulling me close as he kissed me with a hunger that left me breathless. We didn't even make it to the bedroom that time, instead collapsing onto the living room couch in a tangle of limbs and whispered names. It wasn't always at my house. One Saturday afternoon, while Lila was out running errands, Ethan texted me, asking me to meet him at a park we both knew on the edge of town. The idea of being seen sent a thrill of fear and excitement coursing through me. But I agreed, my curiosity outweighing my caution. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting on a bench beneath the shade of a large oak tree. He stood when he saw me, his smile warm but laced with that familiar intensity that made my heart race. "Hey," he said, his hand brushing mine as I sat beside him. We talked for a while, our conversation light and easy, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. When he leaned in, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered, "Come with me," I didn't hesitate. He led me down a secluded path, the trees arching overhead to form a canopy that shielded us from view. When we were sure we were alone, he pulled me close, his hands gripping my waist as his lips found mine. The risk of being caught only made it more exhilarating, and by the time we parted, my legs were shaky, my cheeks flushed, and my mind spinning with the sheer recklessness of it all. But as much as I was swept up in the intensity of our connection, I couldn't ignore the guilt that came with it. Every time I saw Lila, I felt a pang of shame, a reminder of the line I had crossed and the betrayal I was hiding from her. She didn't suspect anything at first, too caught up in her own life to notice the subtle shifts in mine. But the longer this went on, the harder it became to hide. One night, as we sat together on the couch watching a movie, she turned to me suddenly, her brow furrowed. "You've been acting different lately," she said, her tone curious but not accusatory. I froze, my heart racing. "Different how?" "I don't know. Happier, I guess. Lighter." She smiled, nudging me playfully. "Do you have a secret boyfriend or something?" I laughed, the sound forced and unnatural. "Don't be ridiculous," I said, hoping she couldn't see the flush creeping up my neck. She dropped it after that, but her comment stayed with me, a reminder of how precarious the situation had become. Ethan, on the other hand, was unapologetic about what we were doing. He made no effort to hide how he felt, even when I expressed my doubts. "I'm not ashamed of this," he said one evening as we lay tangled together in bed, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "You should be," I replied, though my words lacked conviction. He propped himself up on one elbow, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Why? Because it's not what people expect? Because it's not easy?" "Because it's wrong," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, his expression firm. "It's not wrong if it's real." As time went on, our encounters grew bolder, the lines between caution and recklessness blurring more and more. One afternoon, while Lila was at work, Ethan came over unannounced. We didn't even make it inside that time, instead finding ourselves pressed against the side of the house, hidden from view but exposed enough to send my heart racing. "You're insane," I said breathlessly as he kissed me, his hands gripping my hips. "And you love it," he replied, his grin mischievous. He wasn't wrong. But for all the passion and excitement, there were moments of quiet vulnerability that made this more than just an affair. One night, as we lay together in the dim light of my bedroom, Ethan opened up in a way I hadn't expected. "I always felt like I didn't fit," he admitted, his voice soft. "With Lila, with her friends, even with my own family. But with you," he trailed off, his eyes meeting mine. "With you it feels different. Like I don't have to try so hard." His words left me speechless, a mix of guilt and longing twisting in my chest. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply kissed him, pouring everything I couldn't say into the connection we shared. But as the weeks went on, the fear of discovery began to overshadow the thrill of what we were doing. Every time Lila mentioned Ethan in passing, how she'd run into him at a coffee shop or seen his latest photography post on Instagram, I felt a pang of anxiety, wondering if she'd noticed the change in our dynamic. And then, one night, everything began to unravel. I'd been fooling myself into thinking we could keep going without anyone noticing. But secrets like ours have a way of surfacing, no matter how careful you try to be. The first crack came on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, while Lila scrolled through her phone at the counter. She was telling me about her day, something about a work project and a coworker she couldn't stand. But my attention was divided, my mind drifting to the last time Ethan and I had been together. "And then I saw him at the cafe," she said, her tone sharp enough to pull me out of my thoughts. "Sorry, who?" I asked, feigning interest as I looked up from the cutting board. "Ethan," she said, giving me a curious glance. "I ran into him yesterday. He seemed off. I don't know. Have you seen him lately?" The question hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Why would I have seen him?" I asked, keeping my voice as even as I could. Lila shrugged, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know, he just seemed weird. Like he was distracted or hiding something." My hands stilled, the knife hovering over the cutting board. "Maybe he's just busy," I said quickly, hoping she couldn't see the flush rising in my cheeks. She didn't press the issue, but her words lingered in the air, a subtle warning that the walls we'd built around our secret were starting to crack. The real breaking point came a few days later, when Ethan joined us for dinner. It wasn't planned. Lila invited him on a whim after running into him again, and I didn't have a good enough excuse to say no. From the moment he walked through the door, the tension was unbearable. Ethan tried to act normal, smiling and laughing at Lila's jokes, but I could feel his eyes on me every time she wasn't looking. It was a game of careful avoidance, that both of us pretending there was nothing beneath the surface, while Lila carried on, oblivious to the storm brewing between us. But then, halfway through the meal, she said something that made my stomach drop. "You two seem weird around each other," she said, her tone half joking but laced with suspicion. Ethan froze, his fork hovering midair, while I forced a laugh. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "I don't know," she said, eyeing us both. "You're just weird, like you have some inside joke or something." Ethan recovered first, flashing his signature grin. "Maybe we're just bonding over how picky you are about your food." Lila rolled her eyes, laughing as she took another bite. But I could feel her gaze lingering on me, her suspicion growing with every passing second. The moment Ethan left, Lila turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Okay, what's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp. "What do you mean?" I replied, feigning ignorance as I busied myself with clearing the table. "You and Ethan," she said, crossing her arms. "You've been acting weird around him ever since he started coming around again? Is there something you're not telling me?" The weight of her words pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I opened my mouth to deny it, to brush her off like I had before, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, as the truth hovered between us like a ticking time bomb. "Mom," she said, her voice quieter now, "please don't tell me." I looked away, unable to meet her eyes, and that was all the confirmation she needed. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You and Ethan? Are you serious?" "Leila, I can explain." I started, but she cut me off, her face twisting in anger. "Explain what?" she snapped. "That you've been sneaking around with my ex-boyfriend? That you've been lying to me this whole time?" Tears stung my eyes as I tried to find the words, but nothing I could say would make it better. "How could you do this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "To me? To us?" Her words cut deeper than I thought possible, each one a reminder of the betrayal I'd been trying so hard to ignore. Lila stormed out that night, slamming the door behind her. I tried calling her, texting her, but she didn't respond. The house felt unbearably empty without her, the silence a constant reminder of the damage I'd done. Ethan called me the next morning, his voice filled with worry. "She knows, doesn't she?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my throat tight. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "What now?" "I don't know," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know how to fix this." A week later, Lila came home to pack her things. She didn't say much, her movements stiff and mechanical as she gathered her belongings. "Leila, please," I said, my voice cracking. "Let me explain." She stopped, turning to face me with a look of exhaustion and hurt. "I don't want an explanation," she said quietly. I can't be here right now." Her words broke me, but I knew she was right. There was nothing I could say to undo the damage. Ethan came by later that evening, his expression heavy with guilt. "This is my fault," he said, his voice low. "No," I said firmly, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "We both made this choice." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and familiar, but it didn't bring the comfort it once did. "I think we need to stop," I said, my voice trembling. His grip tightened for a moment before he nodded, his eyes filled with an ache that mirrored my own. "I don't regret us," he said softly, "but I understand." That night, after Ethan left, I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, staring at the empty space where Lila's things used to be. I'd known from the beginning that this was a risk, that it could all come crashing down if we weren't careful. But knowing didn't make it any easier to face the reality of what I'd done. I'd lost my daughter's trust, jeopardized my relationship with the one person who meant more to me than anyone else. And for what? A love that was as exhilarating as it was impossible? For the first time since it all began, I let myself cry. The days after Lila left were some of the loneliest of my life. The house was quiet, in a way that felt oppressive, every room filled with memories of what used to be. Her laughter echoing from the living room, the sound of her feet padding down the hallway, the quiet hum of her voice singing to herself in the mornings, all of it was gone. And in its place was a silence that pressed down on me, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. I threw myself into work, taking on more projects than I could handle, just to avoid the stillness. My evenings were spent with my laptop on the kitchen table, redesigning layouts, answering emails, and pretending that I wasn't checking my phone every few minutes, hoping for a message from her. But Lila didn't call. She didn't text, and every day that passed without hearing from her felt like another nail in the coffin of our relationship. In the absence of Lila and Ethan, I had plenty of time to think about the choices I'd made. I replayed every moment in my mind, searching for the point where it all went wrong, where I could have stopped myself. It wasn't hard to see the truth. I had let myself be swept up in something I knew was dangerous, something I knew would hurt the people I cared about most. I told myself it was worth it, that the connection I felt with Ethan was too strong to ignore. But in the end, all I'd done was create a mess I couldn't clean up. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to regret everything. What Ethan and I had shared was real. It was flawed, complicated, and ultimately unsustainable, but it was real. For the first time in years, I felt wanted, alive, like I was more than just the roles I'd spent my life playing: mother, ex-wife, designer. But the cost of that feeling was too high. A month after Lila left, she called me. The sound of her voice on the other end of the line was both a relief and a stab to the heart. "I'm not ready to come home yet," she said, her tone guarded. "But I thought we should talk." I swallowed the lump in my throat, gripping the phone tightly. "I'd like that," I said softly. We met at a cafe downtown, a neutral place where we could sit across from each other without the weight of the house hanging over us. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed with the kind of pain I'd hoped never to see in her. "I don't even know where to start," she said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "Start anywhere," I said. "I'm just glad you're here." She looked up at me then, her expression a mix of hurt and confusion. "Why, Mom? Why him?" It was the question I'd been dreading, the one I didn't know how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "It just happened. And once it did, I didn't know how to stop it." "That's not good enough," she said, her voice sharp. "I know," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "But it's the truth. I wasn't thinking about you or what it would mean for us. I was selfish, and I'm so sorry." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "You broke my trust," she said quietly. "I don't know how to forgive that." "I understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this, to make it right. Just tell me how." She didn't respond right away, her gaze dropping to her coffee. "I need time," she said finally. "I'll give you as much as you need," I said, the weight of her words settling over me. A week later, Ethan called me. "I'm moving," he said, his voice heavy. "I got a job offer out of state. It's a good opportunity and I think it's time for a fresh start." The news hit me harder than I expected, even though I knew it was coming. "That's good," I said, forcing a smile he couldn't see. "I'm happy for you." "Claire," he started, but I cut him off. "No, it's okay," I said quickly. "You don't have to explain. I understand." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I'm sorry for everything," he said softly. "But I don't regret us." "Me neither," I said, my voice trembling. We said our goodbyes, and when the call ended, I sat on the couch, staring at the phone in my hand. It felt like the closing of a chapter, one that had been as beautiful as it was painful. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my relationship with Lila. It wasn't easy. Trust takes time to mend, and there were days when the distance between us felt insurmountable. But slowly, we began to find our way back to each other. Ethan was a memory now, one that lingered in the quiet moments, but no longer consumed me. I carried the lessons of our time together with me, a reminder of the risks and rewards of following your heart, even when it leads you down a complicated path. I knew I'd made mistakes that hurt the people I loved most, but I also knew that those mistakes didn't define me. Life moves forward, even when it feels like it can't. And while the scars of the past remain, they fade with time, becoming part of the story rather than the whole of it. One evening, months later, Lila and I sat together on the back porch, the warm glow of the sunset casting long shadows across the yard. "Do you think people can really change?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. "I think people can learn," I said, looking over at her. "And sometimes that's just as important." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm still angry," she admitted, "but I'm trying to let it go." "That's all I can ask," I said softly. In that moment, I felt a quiet sense of peace, a glimmer of hope that we were finally moving forward. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I believed we could make it. And that was enough.